Gambling on the Weather by Sebastian Katsbura and Marty Steerice.
This accident report involves a Piper Turbo Arrow being flown by a certified flight instructor with an instrument rating for single-engine land airplanes with 4,890 hours.
The flight was from Sheridan, Wyoming to Bismarck, North Dakota. The pilot radioed that he had lost his gyros and declared an emergency.
At the age of 59, Lowell Dawson was the best-known, best-liked businessman in Sheridan, Wyoming. His enterprises included insurance and real estate agencies, the best sit-down restaurant in town, several other retail and service businesses, and a chunk of the local bank.
He was also a pilot and a passionate supporter of the Sheridan Municipal Airport. However, he only gave time and energy, and none of his money. He was known proudly the self-proclaimed cheapest person in northeastern Wyoming, maybe even all of Wyoming.
He was loved because he gave himself to every cause and person who needed help. That's exactly what the flight to Bismarck was all about.
It all started when 56-year-old Marianne Palmer, a friend of Lowell's, had a middle-of-the-night call from her brother in Bismarck that their 89-year-old mother had taken a sudden turn for the worse. At dawn, she called Lowell and the flight was on, with her paying for the gas and oil, of course.
Lowell then made some calls, one of them to his friend Biff Barnes, a manager of the local flight service station located at Sheridan Airport, but he was at home, so Biff would call back promptly after checking with the briefer on duty. His next call was to the airport flight office, with instructions to pull his Turbo Arrow out of the hangar.
Biff returned the call within 10 minutes, and it wasn't good news. The weather between Sheridan and Bismarck was going to be lousy all day. Okay at Sheridan, IFR at Bismarck, and even worse in between. He advised Lowell not to go, even if it was an emergency, unless he wanted to become an emergency himself.
But Lowell wasn't ready to give up. They had been friends for 35 years, and Lowell trusted Biff. But Marianne was becoming special in Lowell's life, a first since his wife had been killed in an auto accident 4 years ago. He didn't want to disappoint her.
They decided to check the weather again at 9 a.m., and Lowell told Marianne to be ready in 20 minutes so he could pick her up for leisurely breakfast and some extra time together.
The weather news at 9:15 was better, but not much better, but closer to flyable, at least in Bismarck. In between was still IFR, better than before but still IFR. Biff's advice didn't change. He had two very persuasive arguments. First, the next forecast could be worse, and second, Lowell wasn't up to handling low IFR with his questionable IFR proficiency and in his even more questionably maintained arrow.
Lowell knew that Biff wouldn't change his mind, and Biff knew that Lowell and Marianne would take off, try out the in-between, and if it got too tough, they would turn back to Sheridan. He wanted help from Biff, the best weatherman in the territory, as he said, but Lowell wasn't taking no for an answer.
They argued again and agreed to wait for the next hour's forecast and then decide. Lowell was anxious to go, but Biff was worried. He knew how fickle the weather was in the northern plains. He also knew that Lowell was pushing, and pushing isn't safe in an airplane. The 10:15 weather came in, and Biff wanted to throw it away because conditions slightly improved. The forecasts were a little better too, just enough to get an anxious pilot in trouble.
He and Marianne were going to Bismarck, and Biff was going to ride shotgun for them, at least as far as the radio range would permit. At 10:55 a.m., the questionably maintained Turbo Arrow lifted off into the beckoning blue, climbed to 6,500 feet, and settled down into the smooth fall air. Lowell calculated an hour and 50 minutes of flying time for the 300 nautical mile trip. He picked up his mic and called Biff on 123.6 to report their pleasant flight conditions and to check on the latest weather and if there were any pyreps in the area.
There were no pyreps, and the official weather report was worse and going down, but only a little. Biff didn't like the trend, but he couldn't convince them to turn back. Lowell was descending slowly and persistently, but not saying a word to Marianne or Biff. The ceiling was coming down, so was the visibility, and the hills were coming up, slowly. The flight was now 35 minutes out, and the Arrow was down by more than 1,500 feet and still descending. At this point, Lowell was getting concerned and noticing the intermittent readings and waverings of his HSI and DG. This was not a time for panel problems.
With With Lowell in and out of the overcast lair to avoid the looming hills, the Arrow picked the worst possible moment to dump its vacuum system, and with that disabling his HSI and his other gyros. Caught between the clouds and the rising terrain, Lowell cursed as he realized the predicament and began flying needle, ball, and airspeed, the basic instrument scanning procedure that he learned 35 years ago, but hadn't tried or practiced for as long as he could remember. It wasn't coming back easily. He was struggling for control, sorely missing the normal panel scan to keep the airplane flying straight and level.
Finally getting the aircraft under some semblance of control, Lowell called Biff, who was still barely within radio range, and declared an emergency requesting special VFR to anywhere, preferably back to Sheridan. He knew they were only a few miles from Hardy County Airport in Buffalo, South Dakota, but he wasn't sure they could find it in the deteriorating visibility. Biff answered anxiously, told him to stand by while he called in for the clearance, and picked up his phone immediately. Biff got that clearance within 30 seconds and called Lowell right away, but Lowell was out of radio range and didn't realize it for another 3 minutes. So Lowell decided to take matters into his own hands. He did a 180 turn to duck under the overcast layer, but unfortunately, the place he chose to duck under was putting him almost into a hillside.
Lowell did a quick pullback, steadied himself, and climbed back into the overcast. He tried to call Biff again and couldn't get a reply. However, Biff did hear him and did reply immediately, but he never got contact with Lowell. Lowell and Marianne were on their own, and the turbulence picked up, and it began raining even harder. Lowell kept trying the radio. However, Biff can only hear it, and even then so, only on and off. He couldn't help Lowell, and Lowell didn't know he was listening. Biff can hear Lowell's frantic voice in the worsening turbulence and rain. Lowell was losing it, and Biff was helplessly listening, unable to reach his friend who needed a calming voice and a point of reassurance.
For the next 10 minutes, Lowell struggled with the aircraft. The higher he climbed, the more turbulent it got. Going under the overcast layer was out of the question. He wasn't about to tangle with any more of those obscure hilltops. But then he checked his altimeter reading at 4,200 feet and realized they were better off descending trying to get to VFR weather than flying into a hill that would be in cloud like they were.
The Arrow wasn't ready for this, neither were Lowell or Marianne. They were thrown against the sides and ceiling of the cabin, hurting themselves in the severe turbulence. Marianne started grabbing the control wheel as something to hold on to during the turbulence, and this just aggravated the situation and got the plane even more out of control. His response was getting a tighter grip on the control wheel. That resulted in a harder correction and a violent recovery, but a recovery nonetheless. He then climbed to 4,500 feet and turned to 250, reassuring Marianne to calm her down at the same time. He then called Biff again, describing their encounter, hoping for a response this time. A response of any kind.
Biff heard him partially and nearly tried screaming into the mic in hopes that Lowell would catch something. Lowell did catch something, but it was only the words "squall line." This made him tense inwardly, but it was good to hear Biff's voice. For a savored moment, he felt relieved to be back in contact. He never got to reply to Biff's call though, because without warning they hit the leading edge of a developing cell, a nasty one, and were nearly flipped inverted. Lowell didn't know what was going on because his instruments were bouncing and pegging from side to side, but he took what corrective action he could, still fighting Marianne all the way down for the wheel, desperately trying to regain control. Desperately holding on, applying pressures the wrong way, increasing the turn and climb until they went over the top and down, both of them holding on for dear life. Their bodies were found in the same position, both of them with death grips on the wheel. The cabin had been crushed around them from the impact into rising terrain, but mostly crushed from the top and one side, leaving the condition of the instruments in the vacuum system intact enough to verify which ones were and were not working prior to the crash. They found that the vacuum pump had been installed without its shear shaft coupling. Failure was inevitable. It could not have come at a worse time.
And here's an excellent depiction of the height of the hills en route from Sheridan Airport to Bismarck. As you can see, they're high at the beginning, and then near the end they go down, and they crash about just before halfway.
For further investigation revealed that Lowell was a tinkerer and performed much of his own maintenance. This explains why the vacuum system was not correctly installed.
He was not certified to do so. Before the flight took place, a weather briefing was obtained, and there was IFR indicated along the route of flight. The pilot informed the briefer he was conducting the flight in VFR because he did not trust his instruments. And although he was a licensed CFI, the pilot had not given any flight instruction in the past 7 years. He had also not flown IFR at all in the past 3.5 years, usually making the excuse that his panel needed work, but it was probably because he didn't know how to fix it and he didn't want to spend the money to get someone to fix it.
The FAA has begun including do-it-yourself maintenance tips in their accident prevention program seminars. They've been well received, which leads them to believe that there may be more people out there doing their own thing than they thought there were. While the official cause for this accident is listed as pilot error, the unforecasted squall line and the inopportune timing of the failure of his vacuum system certainly played a large role.